In the fast-paced, high-stakes world of global business, a billion-dollar empire is only as strong as its public image. And for Alexander Drake, that image is missing one key element: a wife. Alexander Drake, the powerful CEO of Drake Enterprises, has achieved everything he's ever wanted, except for one thing: stability. With a rival company closing in on a takeover and his investors questioning his ability to secure the future of his company, Alexander finds himself in a desperate position. His name and fortune are at risk, and the only way to save everything he's built is to marry. But not for love. No. He needs a wife to restore his public image and secure an essential business partnership. For a man who's never been swayed by emotions, the idea of using marriage as a mere business transaction is simple enough. But the woman he selects is anything but simple. But he didn't anticipate Ivy Sinclair, her strength, her independence, and the way she challenges everything he believes about love and control. This is the story of how a temporary arrangement became the catalyst for a lifetime of change. If you're ready to hear the whole story, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Now let's get into it. It all started when the pressure to save his empire became more than just about money. It became about survival. Alexander needed a bride, and the woman he chose to play that role would change both of their lives in ways they never saw coming. For Alexander Drake, securing his empire meant playing by a set of rules that never included personal feelings. As he watched Ivy Sinclair step into his office, a woman so out of place in his world of polished suits, polished hands, and polished power, he was reminded that the stakes were much higher than a simple marriage. This was a business transaction. Ivy had agreed to the terms, and now, standing before him, she was preparing to sign the final agreement that would seal her fate, his fate, and that of his company. She was calm, but there was something in her eyes, something guarded, that he couldn't quite place. Maybe it was the weight of the decision. After all, her life was about to change too. She was about to become his wife, in name only, for 1 month. And in return, she would walk away with enough money to secure her daughter's future. He pushed the thought aside and focused on the contract in front of him. This wasn't about emotions. This was about securing his business, about making sure the hostile takeover didn't succeed, and about preserving his legacy. His mother's death had left him with a legacy, but the fortune had been squandered under his father's stewardship. And now, it was up to him to rebuild it, brick by brick. Ivy, with her quiet strength and humble demeanor, was the perfect solution. She had no family connections to speak of, no power to challenge his authority, and as far as he could tell, no great aspirations beyond providing for her daughter. She wasn't a woman who would ask for anything more than the terms of the contract. And yet, Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that he was making a mistake. He was used to being in control, but with Ivy, something felt different. Still, he wasn't in a position to entertain such thoughts. Ivy Sinclair wasn't used to feeling like a pawn in someone else's game. But that was exactly what she was, standing here now, before the man who was about to become her husband, albeit temporarily. It was hard to ignore the suffocating weight of the contract in front of her. She had spent the last few days reminding herself why she was doing this. Her daughter, Lily, needed a future. The debts from her late husband, Mark, needed to be settled. Ivy had no illusions about love or romance. She knew this was a financial arrangement, nothing more. She glanced at the contract, her fingers brushing over the cold paper. She was prepared. The terms were clear, and she had no intention of letting herself be swept away by any feelings of hope or expectation. There would be no affection beyond what was required in public. There would be no illusions about love, no promises of forever. The contract was simple: 30 days of marriage, and after that, she would walk away with enough to ensure her daughter had everything she needed. The terms of the marriage had been laid out with exacting precision. Separate quarters, no public displays of affection, and a clean break after a month. No emotional attachment. She could do this. She had to. But as she looked at Alexander, something nagged at her. His icy demeanor, the way he held himself, the way he seemed to regard everything and everyone as a transaction. It all left a bitter taste in her mouth. She wasn't naive. She'd known men like him, men who saw everything as part of a bigger picture, a business deal. But the way he carried himself, the way his cold gray eyes flickered briefly with something unreadable, something real, made her question her decision. He watched Ivy, waiting for her to break the silence. The room felt too quiet, as though every moment stretched on endlessly. He'd grown accustomed to controlling every aspect of his life, from the boardroom to his personal space. His business dealings, his relationships, they were all carefully curated, meticulously arranged to serve his goals. He had never needed anyone. He certainly didn't need a wife, least of all, a woman like Ivy. But Ivy Sinclair was the answer to his problems. She was a clean slate, someone without connections, without expectations, someone who could play her role and leave when the time was up. He had no doubt that she would fulfill the terms of their arrangement. What he didn't expect was the way she made him feel, like a man standing at the edge of something much deeper than a mere contract. He forced himself to focus on the matter at hand. There would be no complications. There was no room for emotions in this. They had a deal, and it was the only way out. "You've read the contract," he said, his voice steady, cold. "If you're agreeable, we'll sign, and the rest of it is a formality." Ivy didn't hesitate, reaching for the pen and signing her name. She was so composed, so willing to accept this fate. It unnerved him, but he didn't show it. The deal was done. The agreement was simple, so simple that it could have been written on a napkin. Alexander had worked with his lawyer to draft the contract, ensuring it was airtight. The marriage would last for 30 days, during which Ivy would assume the title of wife in public. They would attend social functions, charity events, and business meetings, presenting the perfect picture of a power couple. After 30 days, the union would be annulled. There would be no strings attached, no financial repercussions for either party. Ivy would receive a generous sum in return for her services, money that would ensure her daughter's security for years to come. She would also be entitled to an annuity for her future. Alexander would walk away with the image of stability he needed to secure his business partnership with Lord Harrington. The stakes couldn't have been higher. As the ink dried on the contract, Alexander felt a small sense of relief. The plan was moving forward. He had a wife, albeit a temporary one, and with her by his side, he would win the battle to save Drake Enterprises. There would be no more doubts, no more lingering concerns about his future. He would save everything that mattered. Ivy glanced up at him, her expression unreadable. "When do we start?" she asked. "Immediately," he replied, his tone even. She nodded, standing up from the chair, and for a moment, there was silence between them. It was an awkward silence, but one that neither of them acknowledged. The deal was made, and now they would both play their parts. The following days passed in a blur of meetings, public appearances, and rehearsed smiles. Ivy was thrust into a world of wealth and luxury that felt alien to her. She had never been one for high society or the grandiose settings of power and influence. Her world was smaller, simpler, but now it was a distant memory, replaced by opulent dinners and handshakes from strangers who only saw her as a convenient piece in Alexander's game. She was kept busy, attending events with him, always by his side, never speaking more than necessary. The rules were clear, and she stuck to them. She was his wife in name only, and that's how it would stay. She wore the gowns, smiled for the cameras, and played the part of the perfect wife. But inside, she remained distant. Her heart guarded, her mind focused on one thing: the future she was securing for Lily. At first, she thought it would be easy. But as the days went on, something in her began to shift. The emptiness she'd felt standing beside him at the charity gala, watching him speak with cold precision, began to evolve. She wasn't sure what it was. A flicker of understanding, perhaps, or a sudden connection. But there were moments when she would catch his eyes watching her, moments when she realized she was no longer playing a role for him. She was beginning to see him for who he was, not just the cold, calculated businessman, but someone who, perhaps, felt just as trapped by his world as she felt by hers. It was an early morning when Alexander found himself alone in his office, his thoughts a whirlwind of confusion. He'd watched Ivy carefully, studied her behavior at every event. She was as composed as he'd expected, perhaps even more so. But there was something else, something that stirred beneath the surface. He couldn't figure it out. She was just playing her part, as they both had agreed. And yet, in the brief moments when their eyes met, in the silence that followed their conversations, he couldn't help but feel connected to her. He'd never expected to feel anything more than the transactional nature of their arrangement. But Ivy was more than he'd bargained for. It was dangerous. He couldn't let himself be distracted by her. But as he sat there, staring at the papers on his desk, it became harder to ignore the truth. Ivy Sinclair wasn't just a means to an end. She was a force in his life that he hadn't anticipated. And now, he didn't know what to do about it. The final days of their agreement were fast approaching. But Alexander realized, with a sinking feeling, that their story had only just begun. The first few days at Drake Enterprises had passed in a blur for Ivy Sinclair. The high-rise office buildings, glass walls that gleamed in the city's sunlight, and the constant hum of business were all a world away from her humble beginnings. She hadn't expected it to be easy, but she hadn't expected it to feel so empty. Her life now existed in a series of events: business meetings, public galas, charity functions, all orchestrated for one purpose: to present the perfect image of Alexander Drake and his new wife. But even in the elegance and opulence of Alexander's world, Ivy couldn't shake the gnawing feeling of being out of place. Every time she stepped into a room full of executives or socialites, she was reminded that she was nothing more than a temporary accessory to a man's plan. The grand ballroom of the Drake residence was an imposing setting, one where she often felt like a doll perched on a shelf, only useful when shown to the public. She wore the finest gowns, ones that shimmered like silk under the chandelier's soft light. But every time she moved, it felt as if she were pretending to be someone she wasn't. The walls of Blackwood Manor, which now felt just as cold and distant as her new life, echoed with a sense of isolation. Ivy found herself wandering the sprawling hallways in the evenings, trying to escape the suffocating silence. Still, there were moments when she felt a flicker of something else, something that couldn't quite be defined. It happened when she caught a glimpse of Alexander outside of the carefully curated events. When he walked through the house at night, his gaze fixed somewhere far beyond her, as though he were running from something. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw would clench before he turned away. It wasn't the cool businessman she had signed the contract with. It was something else. Something vulnerable. But every time their eyes met, that flicker would disappear. He was always quick to retreat back into the fortress he had built around himself. Alexander's life was a carefully controlled machine. His mornings were spent in the boardroom, his afternoons in meetings with investors, and his evenings at galas or dinners that were more like business transactions than anything remotely personal. But when Ivy entered the room, everything stopped. It wasn't just her beauty, although that was undeniable. It was the way she seemed to glide through every event with grace, her eyes always observing, never demanding. He saw the way she quietly navigated through conversations with an ease he hadn't expected. She was clever, and her presence often made him feel like he had underestimated her. He thought he had chosen someone who would simply play her part and leave when it was over. But she was more than just a placeholder in his life. The realization disturbed him more than he was willing to admit. Alexander couldn't help but notice her. There was something about the way she held herself, her quiet intelligence that made him question the cold contract they'd signed. He knew why he needed her, a temporary arrangement to secure his business and reputation. But every time they spoke, he felt an unexpected shift inside himself. He wasn't supposed to feel this way. He wasn't supposed to care. But he did. As the days passed, the tension between them grew. They were polite at all times, their conversations brief and always professional. But in the privacy of their shared space, his vast penthouse, his personal study, things felt different. Ivy would slip into her private world of art, finding moments of solace as she painted or sketched by the window. The quiet, the peaceful solitude was a welcome reprieve from the chaos of being the Duchess for the world to see. One afternoon, while working on a piece in the art studio, Ivy felt the presence of someone standing in the doorway. She turned quickly, startled, only to find Alexander leaning against the frame, his gray eyes fixed on her work. He didn't speak for a long time, but his gaze was intense, almost searching. She wasn't sure what he was looking for, her talent, her emotions, or something more, before he finally broke the silence. "Your work is remarkable," he said, his voice low, as though testing the words. Ivy, still caught off guard by his sudden interest, nodded. "Thank you. It's a personal project." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "What does it mean?" "I'm not sure it means anything to anyone else," Ivy replied quietly. "But it's what keeps me grounded." She paused, considering whether to offer more. But she didn't. This was all they needed. Two people bound by a contract, pretending to be something they weren't. Alexander stood in the doorway a moment longer before stepping into the room. "Is it something you'll finish?" he asked. She hesitated, glancing at the unfinished canvas on the easel. "Perhaps. It's a reflection of where I am right now, but I'm not sure what it will say in the end." "Sometimes the final picture isn't clear until the last stroke," he said, an unexpected softness in his tone. Ivy wasn't sure what to make of his words. He had never been anything but transactional with her. So why was he suddenly speaking with such, what? Empathy? Concern? Before she could respond, he turned and left the room, leaving Ivy to ponder his strange words. Something had shifted between them, but she couldn't put her finger on it. The next day, the couple attended their first major event together, an investors' dinner that Alexander had been preparing for weeks. As they entered the ballroom, Ivy immediately noticed the scrutiny. The flashing cameras, the whispered conversations, the raised eyebrows. It was all part of the world she had entered. She was the new Duchess of Blackwood, and everyone was watching. Alexander, ever the stoic figure, led her through the crowd, but there was a flicker of something different in the way he interacted with her. He wasn't as distant as before. He didn't pull his hand away when she reached for his arm. When they were introduced to a particularly powerful investor, Ivy found herself caught in a conversation about architecture. Her voice was calm, confident, as she offered her thoughts on historical buildings she had studied in her youth. Alexander watched her, surprised by the ease with which she navigated the conversation. She wasn't just the arm candy he had expected. She was intelligent, engaged, and utterly unfazed by the world she now inhabited. The conversation was a success. The investor was impressed by Ivy's insights, and the evening went smoothly. But later, as the night came to a close and the two of them were alone in the car on the ride back to the penthouse, something in the air between them shifted again. "You exceeded expectations," Alexander said, his voice calm but with an edge of something. Appreciative? Maybe? Ivy didn't know how to respond. "I was just doing what was required." He glanced at her, his gray eyes studying her. "I think you're capable of more than just doing what's required." Ivy didn't look at him. "I'm not here to do anything else. I'm here for the contract, and I'll leave when the month is up, just like we agreed." There was a long silence before Alexander spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "I don't expect you to stay longer than you want to, but I don't think you'll leave just because the month is up." Ivy's heart skipped a beat, but she kept her gaze fixed on the window, watching the lights of the city blur past. "We'll see." Later that night, alone in her room, Ivy couldn't shake the feeling of uncertainty that had crept into her mind. Alexander's words had caught her off guard. Was there something more to this arrangement than she had expected? She had agreed to this marriage with one goal: to ensure her daughter's future. The money would secure Lily's safety, her education, her future. That was all that mattered. But now, with each passing day, she was beginning to wonder if she was lying to herself. What was this growing sense of connection between them? Was she really just playing a role, or was something more complicated at play? As the moonlight filtered through the curtains, Ivy wondered how long she could keep up the facade, and how long Alexander could too. As Ivy settled into her new role as Alexander's wife, the silence in Blackwood Manor became a constant companion. The grand walls of the estate, with their dark wood and high ceilings, seemed to amplify her sense of isolation. Days turned into weeks, and although the public appearances continued, gala after gala, charity event after charity event, there was still nothing that felt real between her and Alexander. They played their parts in front of the world, but behind closed doors, they were strangers. It was easier this way, Ivy thought. After all, she hadn't expected anything more. The agreement was simple. She would pretend to be his wife, and in return, her daughter's future would be secured. It was a transaction, nothing more. But just as she had begun to settle into the rhythms of this strange new life, a shadow from her past returned, threatening to unravel everything. It was a quiet afternoon when Ivy received an unexpected visitor at the front door of Blackwood Manor. She had been sitting in the drawing room, working on her latest sketch, when she heard the firm knock. She didn't recognize the voice that followed, a man's voice, rough and familiar, though one she hadn't heard in years. "Mrs. Sinclair, I need to speak with you." Her heart sank as she stood up, the pencil dropping from her hand. She knew immediately who it was, her ex-husband, Mark. He had left her years ago, vanishing without a trace, leaving behind a trail of debt and disappointment. Their marriage had been a whirlwind of ambition and broken promises, his gambling habits causing them more problems than Ivy could ever fix. After the divorce, she had worked hard to rebuild her life for herself and for Lily. She hadn't heard from him since, until now. When Ivy opened the door, she wasn't prepared for the man standing there. Mark had changed. His face more lined, his clothes ragged and worn, but his eyes were still the same. Those cold, calculating eyes that had once promised a life of luxury only to lead them into financial ruin. "Ivy," Mark said, his voice strained as though he hadn't expected to find her living in such grandeur. "I need your help. We need to talk." Ivy stood frozen in the doorway, her mind racing. She hadn't expected this. After everything, after years of rebuilding, she was faced with the man who had nearly destroyed everything she had fought for. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice tight. "I thought I'd made it clear that I didn't want anything to do with you." Mark's eyes flickered, but he didn't back down. "You don't have to pretend, Ivy. I know you've been doing well for yourself. I need you to help me just this one time. You owe me to Mum. Don't you?" The nerve of him. It took every ounce of Ivy's composure not to slam the door in his face. She had been living in the shadow of his debts for so long, paying off creditors just to keep them from taking everything she had. And now he had the audacity to show up at her doorstep asking for help? "I owe you nothing," Ivy said, her voice steady despite the fury rising inside her. "I've worked for everything I have now, everything you ruined, I've rebuilt. I don't owe you a thing." Mark didn't flinch at her words. Instead, his eyes darkened. "Then maybe you should ask your rich husband about it. I know he's been taking care of you. I heard the rumors, how you've been living like royalty while I'm left here with nothing. It must be nice, doesn't it? To be married to a billionaire." Ivy's blood ran cold. He couldn't have known. He couldn't have known about the arrangement, about the contract. But the realization hit her with a sharpness that made her breath catch. Mark had been keeping an eye on her, watching her, tracking her every move. "Stay away from me, Mark," Ivy said, her voice low and dangerous. "I will not help you. Not now. Not ever. If you don't leave, I'll call the authorities." Mark's gaze flickered for a moment, but he turned and walked away, disappearing down the long driveway. Ivy stood there, trembling with a mix of anger and fear, staring at the place where he had been. She was no longer the woman he could manipulate, no longer the woman he could control, but the dark weight of his presence still lingered in her chest. When Ivy went inside, her hands shook as she closed the door behind her. She couldn't stop thinking about Mark's words. The rumors, the insinuations. He knew about Alexander, about their marriage, if only in the vaguest of terms. But that didn't change the reality. She was married to him for a contract, not love. And soon enough, Mark would use that against her. She spent the rest of the day trying to focus on her work, but she couldn't shake the unease that had settled in her stomach. Her mind kept wandering back to the idea of Alexander, and how little he truly knew about her. How much of her past she had kept hidden from him. Alexander, for his part, had his own problems to deal with. The partnership with Lord Harrington had been moving forward smoothly, but a last-minute complication with some shareholders threatened to disrupt everything. Despite the growing strain in his own life, he couldn't ignore the odd distance between him and Ivy. She was polite, composed, but there was a coolness in her demeanor that hadn't been there before. It was becoming harder to ignore the fact that their marriage, though temporary in his mind, was starting to affect him more than he had intended. Ivy was becoming more than just a wife for the month. He found himself distracted at meetings, his thoughts drifting to her and the strange silence that had taken over their home. He had never expected her to become a fixture in his life. But now, with every passing day, he was finding it harder to see her as just a business transaction. That evening, as Alexander was finishing up his paperwork, his mind still partially on the unresolved issues at work, he received a call from his lawyer. "Your Grace, there's been an issue." Richard's voice crackled through the phone. "I don't think you're going to like this." "Speak plainly, Richard," Alexander said, his patience wearing thin. "What's the problem?" "It's Miss Sinclair," Richard continued. "It seems her ex-husband has resurfaced. We have reason to believe he's been following her, looking for a way to exploit the situation. I don't have all the details yet, but it's something we need to keep an eye on." Alexander's grip tightened on the phone. "I'll handle it. Make sure he knows his place." As the evening wore on, Ivy couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Mark's appearance had left her rattled, and the nagging sense that her past was about to collide with her present weighed heavily on her mind. She hadn't shared the full extent of her history with Alexander. Not because she didn't trust him, but because she knew it would complicate everything. Her decision to marry him, even for the sake of a contract, had been an act of survival. She had played the role, and now she would continue to do so. But Mark's words, his insinuations, made her wonder how long she could keep pretending. As she sat by the fire that night, the shadows stretching long on the walls, she knew one thing: her past was never going to stay buried forever. And sooner or later, Alexander would learn the truth. But by then, would it be too late? Ivy hadn't expected to feel this way. In the weeks since Mark had appeared at Blackwood Manor, everything had started to shift. The strange sense of foreboding hadn't left her. It clung to her like an unwanted shadow. But it wasn't just that. Something else had begun to change. Something she hadn't anticipated when she agreed to this arrangement. Something she didn't know how to name. Alexander. She wasn't sure when it had happened or how. But somewhere between the carefully orchestrated galas and the polished smiles, a connection had formed. It had started as small things. Moments when their eyes met just a little too long, a comment or a gesture that lingered longer than necessary. But those moments were becoming harder to ignore, more frequent. The professional distance she had once maintained was now something she was struggling to uphold. She wasn't supposed to feel anything beyond what the contract demanded. She was a business arrangement, a temporary figure in his life. She had told herself that over and over. But now it was different. For Alexander, the change was subtle, almost imperceptible at first. It wasn't until he noticed how often he was thinking about Ivy when he was alone in his study, going over the numbers for his business, that he realized something had shifted. She was always on the periphery of his thoughts, even when she wasn't in the room. The way she handled herself in public, calm, collected, always poised, impressed him more than he was willing to admit. But it wasn't just that. It was the quiet moments, the stolen glances between them that lingered in the corners of his mind long after the event had ended. It hadn't been the first time he had been attracted to someone. But with Ivy, it was different. She wasn't trying to win him over with charm or wit. She wasn't trying to be something she wasn't. And that authenticity, that rawness, began to draw him in. He found himself looking at her more closely, noticing the way she smiled at Lily, the way she held herself with grace, even in the most uncomfortable situations. But the contract was clear. This was supposed to be temporary. There could be no feelings involved. He wasn't about to risk everything, his empire, his future, for something as intangible as emotions. But the more he tried to ignore it, the stronger the pull became. The evening started like any other event. The grand ballroom filled with the clinking of glasses and low murmurs of conversation. As always, Alexander was the center of attention, his sharp suit a statement of power and dominance. Ivy, standing beside him, was no longer the uncertain woman she had been when they first met. She had learned the rhythm of this world, the unspoken rules of wealth and status. She was graceful, poised, playing her role with a quiet confidence. But as they moved through the crowd, something felt different. Their interaction was more natural now, their conversations flowing effortlessly. Alexander found himself slipping into a comfort with Ivy that he hadn't anticipated. He didn't want to admit it, but there was something about her that made him feel, dare he think it, human again. She wasn't a pawn, a business transaction. She was an enigma. And the more he tried to understand her, the more he realized how little he truly knew. The auction began, and the first item up for bidding was a priceless piece of art, something that made even the wealthiest of the guests pause. As the auctioneer called out the bids, Ivy found herself drawn to the piece. She had never been one to focus on wealth, but art, in its raw, unfiltered form, was something she understood. She could feel the emotion, the history embedded in each stroke, each color choice. She caught herself staring at the painting, a mix of awe and longing in her eyes. She didn't hear Alexander's approach until his voice cut through her reverie. "Do you want it?" Ivy blinked, startled. She turned to face him, her heart racing slightly. I wasn't thinking of buying it." But Alexander wasn't looking at her. His eyes were fixed on the auctioneer as he raised his paddle and placed a bid. "I think you should have it," he said quietly. "I'm not here for material things," she replied, a bit sharper than she meant. It was the truth. She had never cared for wealth or status, not in the way most people did. She just wanted security, and for Lily to have a future, something stable and free from the burdens of debt and uncertainty. Alexander raised an eyebrow. "I didn't say it was for me." Ivy's heart skipped. "What do you mean?" But before he could answer, the auctioneer called out the final bid. The painting was sold. Ivy had almost forgotten that she had even been thinking about it. But the look on Alexander's face when he turned to her was unreadable. He hadn't just bought the painting for himself. He had done it for her. Later, in the quiet of their carriage ride home, the silence between them felt heavier than usual. Ivy wasn't sure what to make of it. The gesture, though small, had taken her by surprise. She had expected a man like Alexander to remain the cold, distant businessman she had come to know. But this felt different. The painting had arrived at Blackwood Manor before them, and when they entered the house, Ivy was drawn to the piece immediately. It was beautiful, more so than she had imagined. She hadn't wanted it, but now that it was here, she realized something. Something shifted within her. Alexander had given it to her because he had seen something in her, something beyond the role she had played. He had seen the artist within her, the woman who wasn't just an accessory. She walked up to it, her fingers hovering just inches above the canvas. She could feel the weight of the moment, of the gesture, but she didn't know what to do with it. She turned around to find him standing in the doorway, watching her. "Why?" she asked, her voice quiet, but full of something she couldn't quite name. "Because I thought you'd appreciate it," he said simply. "And because you deserve something more than just a contract." Ivy's heart skipped. His words, so simple yet so significant, left her momentarily speechless. She wasn't sure how to respond, or even if she should. What did it mean? She had entered into this marriage with one purpose in mind: to secure a future for Lily. She had convinced herself it would remain purely transactional. But now, Alexander's gesture had complicated everything. It had blurred the line she had so carefully drawn. "I'm not here for you to pity me," Ivy said, trying to hide the emotions welling up inside her. "I don't need your charity." He stepped closer, his voice lowering. "I'm not pitying you, Ivy. I'm trying to understand you." She swallowed hard, her mind racing. He was trying to understand her, wasn't he? But why? Why did it matter now? And that was when she realized it. Alexander Drake wasn't just the man she had married for a month. He was beginning to care, in a way she hadn't expected. And that terrified her. That night, as she lay in bed, the weight of everything pressed down on her. The life she had built, the contract she had agreed to, the man she was bound to for a month. It was all starting to feel more complicated. She had come to Blackwood Manor for a reason. She had come for Lily, for security. But now, with each passing day, she couldn't ignore the growing connection between herself and Alexander. What would happen when the month was up? Would they return to being strangers again, just as the contract dictated? Or would everything they had built, the brief moments of connection, the unspoken understanding, fall apart? Ivy didn't have the answers, but one thing was certain. The lines between business and personal had blurred, and she didn't know if she could go back to the way things were. The morning after the auction, Ivy awoke to an unsettling silence. The house was quiet. The only sounds the faint creak of the floorboards as the servants moved about their duties. She sat up in bed, her thoughts a jumble of confusion and uncertainty. The gift from Alexander, the painting, had been a catalyst. It was the first real crack in the wall of their arrangement, and now, every time she thought about it, she was confronted with the realization that the lines between duty and emotion were becoming dangerously blurred. She could no longer ignore the fact that she was feeling something. Something far more complicated than mere gratitude for the security the contract had promised. There was something about the way Alexander had looked at her last night. Something in his eyes that told her he wasn't just fulfilling an obligation. But how could that be? This was a business arrangement, a contract, a temporary solution to a very real problem. They weren't supposed to feel anything for each other. Ivy sighed, running her hands through her hair. She couldn't let herself get lost in this. The months to come would be complicated enough without her complicating matters further. She had to stay focused on what mattered. Her daughter. Lily's future. When Ivy made her way downstairs, she found Alexander already in the breakfast room, going over a stack of papers. His usual composed demeanor was in place, but his eyes flicked up to meet hers the moment she entered. There was something different in his gaze, something that caught her off guard. "Good morning," he said, his voice smooth but with a hint of something else. It was almost like an apology, or maybe it was something deeper. She wasn't sure. Ivy nodded, sitting across from him at the large table. She couldn't help but notice how the room seemed to close in around them. There were no reporters, no guests, no cameras. It was just the two of them, alone. And the air between them was thick with something unspoken. "Thank you for the painting," Ivy said quietly, her fingers curling around the edge of her coffee cup. "But I'm not sure what you expect from me in return." Alexander leaned back in his chair, studying her with those unreadable gray eyes. "I didn't expect anything," he replied, his voice low. "I just thought you might appreciate it. Because you think I'm the kind of woman who needs to be appreciated?" Ivy's words were sharper than she intended, but the edge of defensiveness in her voice couldn't be helped. She didn't want to feel like a charity case, especially from him. "I never said that," he replied, his voice remaining even. "I just thought you would like it, and I thought it might help. Give you something more than just this contract." Ivy's breath hitched slightly. The words, simple as they were like a dagger to the wall she had built around her heart. Did he think she was just some accessory in his life? Did he think she needed something more than the arrangement they had? She wasn't sure she could bear it if it was true. "I don't need anything, Alexander," she said, her voice calm but resolute. "Not from you. I'm here because of the contract. You wanted a wife for a month, that's all." There was a long pause as he absorbed her words. She saw his jaw tighten, but he didn't argue. Instead, he took a deep breath and nodded. "Understood," he said, though the weight of the silence between them was undeniable. Ivy couldn't shake the feeling that they were both dancing around something that neither of them wanted to confront. But this wasn't a romance. This was a deal. And she wasn't about to let herself lose sight of that. Later that day, Ivy found herself in the gardens of Blackwood Manor, the sun warming her face as she strolled along the winding path. The flowers were in full bloom, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the dark thoughts swirling in her mind. She had to clear her head, had to remind herself of why she was here. This wasn't about Alexander. It couldn't be. She stopped by the rose bushes, leaning down to admire the deep crimson petals, the soft scent filling the air. But before she could take in another breath, she heard footsteps behind her. "Ivy." She turned quickly to find Alexander approaching, his expression neutral, though there was something more in his eyes now. Something more personal. "I didn't expect to find you out here," he said, his voice low, but not as cold as usual. "I needed a moment to think," Ivy replied, her gaze drifting back to the flowers, unwilling to meet his eyes. It's a lot to process." "I know," he said, his tone softening. "I didn't mean to push you with the painting or with anything else. I just thought, I don't know what I thought. I thought maybe you'd appreciate it." She could feel his gaze on her, like an invisible thread pulling her attention toward him. The distance between them had grown smaller over the last few weeks. And now, standing here with him in the quiet of the garden, she felt the weight of it. "I appreciate it, but I don't need gifts or gestures," she said, finally meeting his gaze. "I need security. For my daughter." Alexander nodded slowly, but there was something else in his expression. Something like understanding, and yet a flicker of something more. Something he wasn't saying. Something he wasn't ready to admit. "I get that," he said, his voice rough around the edges. "But sometimes, security isn't just about money or contracts. Sometimes it's about trust. And I think—" He stopped, his breath catching in his throat. Ivy stared at him, her heart beating faster than she wanted to admit. What was he trying to say? "You think what?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander took a step closer, his gaze intense. "I think that you're beginning to trust me, just like I'm beginning to trust you." Ivy's breath hitched. "No, Alexander, this isn't trust. This is business. This was always business. But her words felt empty even as she said them, because deep down, she knew he was right. She had begun to trust him, even though she shouldn't, even though it wasn't part of the plan. As the tension between them mounted, the realization that their temporary arrangement was quickly becoming something more hung in the air. Ivy had promised herself that she wouldn't get attached, that she would stick to the contract and leave when the time was up. But now, every moment spent with him, whether they were in the same room or not, left her wondering if she was already too far gone. They stood there in the garden for a moment longer, the weight of their shared silence thick in the air. Neither of them spoke, and neither of them moved, as if waiting for something to break the tension between them. But nothing did. Finally, Ivy spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I can't let this go any further," she said, her words quiet but firm. "This was never supposed to be more than a contract." Alexander didn't say anything at first, just nodded slowly, as if accepting the finality of her words. But in his eyes, Ivy saw the flicker of something deeper, a feeling that neither of them were willing to admit. "Then we have a deal," he said softly, before turning and walking away. Ivy stood frozen in the garden, the realization of what had just happened sinking in. She had just told herself to walk away, to keep her distance. But as Alexander disappeared into the house, a part of her knew that it was already too late. The following days after their conversation in the garden felt like a strange limbo for Ivy. The events of that afternoon lingered in her thoughts, and despite her best efforts, she couldn't shake the feeling that the lines between their contract and something more were becoming increasingly blurred. Every encounter with Alexander, every word exchanged, seemed to deepen the connection they'd started to form without ever intending it. She had always told herself that she could handle this arrangement, a business deal, a solution for both their problems. But now, as she stood in the grand hallway of Blackwood Manor, gazing at the long corridor that led to Alexander's study, she wasn't so sure. Her heart had begun to make choices her mind couldn't quite follow. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. "Mrs. Sinclair, His Grace is expecting you." The butler's voice came through the door. Ivy straightened her back and gave a silent nod. "I'll be there in a moment." She had expected this meeting. It had been on her calendar for the past week. But something about it now felt different. The contract had been clear from the start, 30 days of marriage and then an end. But with each passing day, with each unspoken glance and half-formed word, she was beginning to question what the end would really mean. Would she just walk away, as if nothing had ever happened between them? Or would there be a decision to make, one she wasn't prepared for? When Ivy entered the study, Alexander was standing by the large bay window, his back turned toward her. The city skyline in the distance was bathed in the soft orange glow of the evening sun, and for a moment, she was struck by the loneliness of the figure in front of her. "Good evening," she said quietly, her voice uncertain. He turned, his face unreadable as always. "Good evening, Ivy," he replied, his tone neutral. "Please have a seat." Ivy sat, the chair creaking slightly under her weight. There was a heaviness to the air, an unspoken tension between them. But it was more than just the residual awkwardness from their last conversation. She could sense it, the uncharted territory they were standing on. "I asked you here because there are some things we need to discuss," Alexander began, his voice calm but laced with something more, something that made Ivy sit up straighter. He wasn't just going to talk about business. Not this time. Ivy nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Of course. What is it?" Alexander stepped toward the desk and picked up a folder from the top. He placed it in front of her, and she looked down to see a series of documents. More contracts, more legal agreements. But this wasn't just a business arrangement. It wasn't just about her temporary role as his wife. "It's about the future," Alexander continued, his voice quiet but deliberate. "Not just your future, but mine as well." Ivy furrowed her brow. "I don't understand." "You will." He paused, watching her carefully. "The partnership with Lord Harrington is secured, as you know. The investment is sound. But there's a new complication I didn't foresee." Ivy blinked, trying to follow his words, but she could feel something beneath them. Something he wasn't saying outright. "What kind of complication?" "Rumors," he said, his eyes darkening. "Not about the business itself, but about my marriage. Specifically, about us." Ivy's stomach dropped. "What rumors?" Alexander's gaze softened slightly. "There are whispers in the circles we frequent, among my business partners, among the elite. People are starting to ask questions. Why a man like me, with everything I've built, would suddenly marry someone like you?" His words hit Ivy like a slap. She wasn't sure what was more shocking. The fact that he had said it so plainly, or that it somehow made sense. The whispers, the questions. She had expected them. She had told herself they would come. But hearing it from him in this way made it feel real. "I don't care what people think," Ivy said, her voice shaking slightly. But there was determination in her tone. "I'm not here for their approval. I'm here because of the contract," Alexander finished for her. "I know. But this is different. This is no longer just about our business arrangement. These rumors could hurt us both. And it's not just the social consequences I'm concerned about. If they get out of hand, it could affect the trust fund I've worked to secure." Ivy's mind was racing. She had never asked for this, never wanted to be part of his business world, his public life, but it seemed that, despite the contract, she had already become entangled in it. "Is this what you want?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "More rumors? More complications? This marriage is supposed to end in a month. That was the plan. What else is there to say?" Alexander's gaze was intense. "The rumors won't stop if we let them fester. And I don't want you to walk away at the end of this without anything. I don't want you to feel like you've been used." Ivy stared at him, her thoughts in turmoil. "Then what do you suggest? We make this real?" He hesitated, then slowly nodded. "For the next month, we need to present a united front. But after that, there's something I've been thinking about. Something more." Her heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure if she should be afraid or relieved. "What do you mean? What more could there be?" "There's a part of me," he paused, as though searching for the right words. "I don't know how to say this without sounding like a fool, but I don't want to lose you. Not just as a business partner, not just as a temporary wife. You've become more to me, Ivy, and I think you've started to feel the same way." Ivy sat back in the chair, her thoughts spinning. She had known, on some level, that this was coming. The moment they crossed the threshold from business to something personal was inevitable. But now, hearing the words from Alexander's mouth, she realized how complicated things had truly become. "Alexander," she began, her voice steady but her heart racing. "This arrangement wasn't meant to be anything more than what it was. And I need you to understand something. I can't do this if it's more than that. I can't afford to." Alexander took a step closer, his eyes locked onto hers. "I understand. But I want you to know that when the month ends, I want you to have a choice. A real choice, Ivy. Not just a contract." Ivy swallowed hard, her breath catching in her throat. What did that mean for her? For them? "I need time to think," she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. "This wasn't what I expected." "I know," Alexander said softly. "But I'm not going to let you walk away without knowing that you have a choice. Whether you stay or leave, it will be your decision, not just mine." The days following their conversation in the study were filled with a tense uncertainty. Ivy spent the time alone, taking long walks around the estate, trying to clear her head. The weight of the decision, whether to stay in the marriage, whether to accept Alexander's feelings, felt like an insurmountable burden. She had made it this far, knowing the contract would expire soon. But now she was faced with the reality that the end might not be so simple. There was a part of her, something deep inside, that was beginning to care about Alexander more than she ever intended. But could she trust him? Could she trust herself? As the final days of the month loomed ahead, Ivy knew that the choice before her was no longer just about money or security. It was about something more complicated, something she wasn't sure she was ready for. But one thing was clear: the end of the contract would not be the end of their story. The clock seemed to tick louder in Ivy's ears as the days wore on. Every step she took around Blackwood Manor felt like a step toward an inevitable conclusion. And yet, she was paralyzed. The impending end of the contract loomed, like a dark cloud hanging over her. But now the question wasn't so simple. What would happen when the month was up? Every part of Ivy's mind screamed at her to stick to the plan, to walk away. This had always been a business deal, an arrangement to secure a future for Lily. No matter what she felt for Alexander or what she thought she might be feeling, the truth remained unchanged. This was a contract, nothing more. But her heart, that treacherous thing, kept pulling her back into the confusing web they'd started to weave together. She couldn't ignore the way he had looked at her the night before. The softness in his voice, the way he had promised that she would have a choice when the time came. It was early evening when Ivy found herself standing by the large windows in the drawing room, staring out at the sprawling grounds of Blackwood Manor. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden hue across the rolling hills. It was a view she had grown accustomed to over the past few weeks. But tonight, it felt different. There was something about the light, the air, that made everything feel more significant. Behind her, she heard the door open softly, and then the familiar sound of footsteps. Ivy didn't have to turn around to know it was Alexander. "May I join you?" His voice was quiet, but she could hear the unspoken question in it. He had been giving her space, respecting the distance she had put between them. But Ivy could feel that he was waiting for her decision. She didn't respond immediately, just continued to gaze outside. Her heart was beating faster now, and she knew she couldn't keep running from the truth. "I didn't expect this," she said, finally turning to face him. Her voice was steady, but there was a vulnerability to it that she couldn't mask. "I didn't expect to be here with you." Alexander's gaze softened. "I didn't either," he admitted, "but here we are." There was a long silence as they simply stood there, taking each other in. It wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't uncomfortable either. It was something else entirely. A moment of truth. One that neither of them could avoid any longer. Ivy took a deep breath, gathering the courage to say the words that had been weighing heavily on her chest. "When I first came here," she began slowly, "I had a plan. I had a goal. I knew what I needed, and I didn't think anything beyond that would matter. And now?" Alexander's voice was soft, almost too gentle for the gravity of the moment. "I don't know," Ivy said honestly. "I don't know what I want anymore. I don't know what I'm supposed to do." Alexander stepped closer, his presence as imposing as it was comforting. "I don't want to make this decision for you, Ivy. I want you to make it on your own terms. You've always been strong, always independent. But I think you're afraid of what this could mean." "I'm afraid of a lot of things," Ivy replied, her voice catching. "But what I'm most afraid of is that I'm starting to feel something I shouldn't, and that maybe I'm starting to care about you more than I should." There it was, the confession that had been lodged in her chest for so long, the truth she had tried so hard to deny. She had been lying to herself, pretending that this marriage, this arrangement, was only about security. But somewhere between the charity galas, the quiet evenings in his office, and the moments of unexpected tenderness, she had started to care for him. Not just as a business partner, not just as a man she had been hired to be married to for a month, but as something more. And that scared her more than anything. Alexander stood in front of her, his gaze unwavering, as if searching her face for any trace of hesitation or doubt. "I've been thinking about this too. More than I should. I never expected this to happen. I thought I could keep my emotions at bay, keep this as nothing more than a deal. But every time I see you, every time you speak, I'm reminded that you're not just some accessory. You're not just a wife for a month. You're everything." Ivy's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment she thought she might collapse under the weight of his words. His honesty, his raw vulnerability, struck her harder than she was ready for. "I don't know how this happened," Alexander continued, taking a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "But what I do know is this. I don't want to lose you, and I won't let you walk away without knowing that you have the choice to stay. A real choice. Not just out of duty or obligation, but because you want to. Because I want you to want me." Ivy stood frozen in place, her heart pounding as her mind raced. Everything about this situation felt like a whirlwind, and she hadn't been ready for it. She hadn't been prepared for him to say these things, to offer her this choice. "I never thought it would come to this," Ivy said quietly, her voice shaking with a mix of fear and hope. "I thought I could walk away from this without feeling anything. But now I can't even pretend anymore." "I don't want you to pretend," Alexander said, his voice low and sincere. "I don't want you to feel like you have to walk away because of some contract we signed. You don't owe me anything. Not anymore." Ivy's gaze flickered down to her hands, her fingers trembling slightly. "But what happens after the month? What happens when it's over?" Alexander's response was calm, but unwavering. "That's up to you. The contract ends, yes. But if you're willing to stay, if you want to stay, I want you here, with me, for as long as you want." She looked up at him then, her heart heavy with the weight of his words. Could she really make that choice? Could she choose him, despite everything? The silence between them stretched, but it was different now. It wasn't filled with uncertainty, but with understanding. And in that moment, Ivy knew. She knew that the choice before her wasn't just about a contract or a month. It was about her future, about what she wanted, about what they could become. "I don't have all the answers," Ivy said softly, taking a step toward him. "But I'm willing to figure it out. Together." Alexander's face softened, and for the first time in weeks, Ivy saw something in his eyes that wasn't just the sharp edge of a businessman. It was vulnerability. It was hope. "I think that's all we need," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Together." And in that moment, the weight of everything, the past, the future, the contract, the promises, began to feel lighter. It was still uncertain, but it wasn't a burden anymore. It was the beginning of something new. Something neither of them had expected, but something they were both willing to fight for. The days that followed Ivy's decision to stay were a whirlwind, but they were filled with an unexpected sense of peace. The tension between her and Alexander had dissipated, replaced by an openness that neither of them had anticipated. They were no longer bound by the constraints of a business arrangement, but by something deeper, something more real. As the final days of the contract approached, Ivy found herself reflecting on how far they had come. She had come to Blackwood Manor as a woman with a singular goal: to provide a stable future for Lily. But now, she was no longer the woman who had walked through the doors a month ago. She had found a connection with Alexander that she hadn't thought was possible. And that connection had changed everything. The evening before the contract was set to expire, Ivy found herself standing in the study again, staring at the stack of legal documents that had originally brought her here. But this time, the documents didn't feel as heavy. This time, they felt like the beginning of something else. Something that didn't require signatures or clauses, but trust. Alexander was in the room, his usual confident demeanor softened, as though he too was still coming to terms with the shift that had occurred between them. He had spent the past few weeks opening up to her in ways she hadn't expected, and in return, Ivy had done the same. She had shared parts of herself, her fears, her hopes, her dreams for Lily, that she had kept hidden for years. Neither of them had expected this. Neither of them had expected to find something more than what the contract offered. "Are you sure about this?" Alexander asked, his voice low as he walked over to stand beside her. His presence was steady, comforting, but there was a vulnerability in his eyes now, one that matched the tenderness in her chest. "I'm sure," Ivy replied, turning to face him. "This wasn't part of the plan, but I think it was always meant to be. You and me. We're not bound by a contract anymore. We're something else." Alexander reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair from her face, his touch soft but firm. "I never thought I could feel this way. Not about someone like you. But I've never been more certain about anything in my life." Ivy smiled, a warmth spreading through her that she hadn't expected. "Neither have I," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "But I think I'm ready to take the next step. With you." They sat down together, the weight of the documents between them now seeming insignificant. Ivy knew that they had already moved beyond the confines of the contract, beyond the paper that had originally defined their relationship. What they had now was something much stronger, a partnership. "You know," Alexander said after a long pause, his voice filled with a soft humor, "I never imagined a marriage like this. I thought it was just about business, about getting the investment secured, keeping up appearances. But with you, Ivy, it's different. I see things I never saw before." I feel things I never thought I would feel." Ivy reached out to take his hand, her fingers brushing against his, the connection between them solidifying with each touch. "I never thought this was possible. I came here for Lily, to secure her future. I thought I could leave everything else behind. But I couldn't leave you behind. Not anymore." Alexander squeezed her hand gently, his expression softening. "Then let's not look back. Let's move forward. Together. No more contracts. No more bargains. Just us." Ivy's heart fluttered as she looked at him, her thoughts drifting to the future. The future she had never allowed herself to dream of. Until now. She could see it in her mind. A life with Alexander. A life where Lily had everything she needed. And a life where love, not business, was at the center of it all. "Yes," she said softly, the words filled with certainty. "Just us." The following week, after days of thoughtful conversations, moments of shared laughter, and late-night discussions about what the future would look like, Alexander made a decision that surprised them both. He wanted to marry her, for real this time. Not as a business arrangement, but as an equal partner, as the woman he loved. The wedding was small, an intimate gathering in the Blackwood Gardens, surrounded by only their closest friends and family. It wasn't a grand affair, but it was perfect. Ivy stood in a simple yet elegant gown, the soft breeze playing with her hair, as Alexander took her hand and promised to love her, to cherish her, for the rest of their lives. There were no contracts to sign, no clauses to negotiate. Just two people, standing together in the middle of the garden, promising to face whatever life threw at them, together. "I promise you," Alexander whispered, as he slid the ring onto her finger, his eyes full of devotion. "This is no longer just about business. This is about us. Forever." Ivy smiled, her eyes brimming with tears. "I never thought I'd find a love like this. But I have, and I'm never letting it go." As the days turned into weeks, Ivy and Alexander began to build the future they had always dreamed of, though never thought possible. The business deals that had once been their sole focus were now just one part of their shared life. Together, they focused on their family, their love, and the growing bond between them. Alexander was no longer just the cold businessman she had first met. He was her partner, her equal. And Ivy was no longer the woman driven only by survival. She was the woman who had found love. Something real, something beautiful. Blackwood Manor, once a symbol of isolation and duty, became a home, alive with laughter, filled with the sound of their children's footsteps and the warmth of a family that had been born from a contract, but had blossomed into something much more powerful than either of them had anticipated. Ivy had come to Blackwood for one reason, but in the end, she had found something far more precious than she could have ever imagined. Together, she and Alexander had written their own story, one not defined by the contract that brought them together, but by the love that had bound them from the very start.